Hello, and welcome to the fifth in a series of webinars hosted by the Religious Freedom Institute's Middle East Action Team and our Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team. My name is Jeremy Barker. I serve as the director of our revised Middle East work. Joining me today, my co-host in this series is Ismail Royer, who directs our Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team.
Welcome.
Ismail, thanks for joining us. So, as I mentioned, this is the fifth in a series of events looking at the relationship between Islam and the state on both a theoretical and now moving to a very practical level. And so in these conversations, we've looked at the nature of the emergence of the modern nation state with Professor Leah Greenfield, looked at some of this within the Islamic tradition with speakers like Recep Şentürk. We had an earlier case study with the Bosnian experience, and for today's event, looking much more at a contemporary issue with recent developments, both law and society in Europe, France in particular, but across the continent, and have a number of great speakers joining us today. So Ismail, why don't you preview a bit more of today's conversation as well as introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Jeremy. So in our previous webinars, we focused on Islam and the state in Muslim majority countries, in areas where an Islamic empire once ruled, and now the Muslims live under more or less modern nation states. And so our inquiry was really how is Islam lived in such circumstances, and with a focus on as well religious rights in those situations. So today, what we're going to do is have a look at how Islam is affected by, or how Islam is lived under the modern nation state in Europe. And we've focused on France in in the title of this webinar, but we're really going to talk about beyond that, mostly in continental Europe. I think we probably won't get too much into the United Kingdom. And so our guests today that we're going to have are Lorenzo Vedin, Dr. Lorenzo Vedin. He is the director of the George Washington University's program on extremism. And he is an expert on Islamism in Europe and North America. His research over the past 20 years has focused on the mobilization dynamics of jihadist networks in the West, governmental counter-radicalization policies, and the activities of Muslim Brotherhood-inspired organizations in the West. And I could go on and on, but I'll read one more paragraph of his biography to give you some background. He's a native of Italy who holds American citizenship, and he earned a law degree from the University of Milan Law School, and he has a doctorate in international relations from Tufts University. He's held positions at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government, the U.S. Institute for Peace, the RAND Corporation, and the Center for Security Studies in Zurich. And I think he'll also tell us some more information about himself that will give us some background as to his not only knowledge of this, but also direct involvement in the policies of governments in Europe. And our second guest is Dr. Shadi Hamid, and he is a senior fellow in the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute. And he's the author of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize. He's also the co-editor with Will McCants of Rethinking Political Islam, and the co-author of Militants, Criminals, and Warlords, The Challenge of Local Governance in an Age of Disorder, published by Brookings Institution. And he served as director of research at the Brookings Doha Center until January 2014. And he's a contributing writer at The Atlantic and vice chair of the Project on Middle East Democracy's Board of Directors. So we have two very, very distinguished and knowledgeable guests here, and suffice to say they most likely come on quite different sides of the issue that we're going to discuss. And that issue that we're going to discuss is, what is the nature of the challenge of Islamic, or let's say Islamist-inspired terrorism in Europe, and as well in general, just the concern with what many European countries characterize as separatism and Islamism. So, what is the nature of that? To what extent is that a problem? And the way that these countries these governments are dealing with it, how are these appropriate means, or are they causing more problems than they are good? Are they contributing to the problem, or are they likely to help resolve it? And what are the collateral consequences for freedom of these problems? And Jeremy, would you like to introduce our final commentator here, Osman Softic from Sarajevo?
Yep, certainly. So Osman Softic has been our third conversation partner in this series, who's a coordinator with the Bosnia Center on Bosnia Foreign Relations Council, as well as a number of other initiatives, and brings a wealth of experience both from his time in Bosnia as well as studies in Australia as well, and so has provided a useful voice in these conversations. So Osman, good to have you on again. A bit of the flow for this, so we'll open with Lorenzo. We'll turn to you first to kind of start this, and then Shadi will have the floor in response, and then we'll flow into or go into what I'm sure will be a flowing discussion for the balance of the time. So Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really want to thank the Institute for organizing the event today. Very interesting topic. And Ismail in particular, thank you for inviting me. Let me start by sort of contextualizing what we were talking about and what is going on in Europe when it comes to Islamism and the debate. Now, of course, as Ismail said, we're talking a lot about France. France gets all the headlines, and unquestionably the debate in France has been particularly intense. But what we're seeing is hardly limited to France, and I think there's a value in expanding the conversation to most continental Europe. Ismail is perfectly right in saying that the UK is a bit untouched by this debate, which is an interesting dynamic because 10 years ago, or 5 or 6 years ago, was the exact opposite. The UK was sort of leading the way in having muscular conversations and actions when it comes to Islamism, and now it's kind of the opposite. But we're seeing a lot of debate in Austria, of course, which actually started well before Macron, and we're seeing also very lively debate in Germany, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. So I think there's two things that are, as initial comments, are fair to say about these debates. The first of all is that they're not primarily about terrorism and about radicalization. The concerns at this point are mostly through the lenses of social cohesion, integration, what the French call separatism, and the concerns are about the activities of non-violent Islamist groups, whether it's Brotherhood, Salafis, or similar groups, and their impact on society. Now, of course, the terrorist attacks are always there. They heighten.
Ismail, are you still there?
I'm still here. Lorenzo, you seem to have been cut off. Perhaps we can ask you to perhaps sign out and then come back in and rejoin. He's been cut off, but maybe we could move to Shadi. What do you think? And ask Shadi to do his piece. Shadi, did you have something to do with that?
An easy way to win the debate.
No, I'm innocent in this regard.
Okay. Well, why don't you go ahead and give us your thoughts on these subjects, and then we'll ask Lorenzo to respond to you.
Okay. That said, I suppose then Lorenzo will not be fully aware of my opening gambit here. But so first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and obviously a very important and spicy debate. Let me just maybe start with some of my first principles, my biases, if you will. It's good to be frank about those. Well, so I think some of this, a lot of this debate has to do with how we perceive questions of difference and whether we prefer in modern societies to have a uniformity or unity. If we look at France, just to focus on France as as the country where this debate is most intense. From a constitutional standpoint in France, there is no official recognition of ethnic or religious difference. Difference is not something to accept and certainly not something to embrace. And the reason for this is that difference is seen as undermining equality before the state. So what this means in practice is that French citizens only exist as individuals in relationship to the state. And that means that French Muslims do not exist as French Muslims, or that is not their primary identity. In some ways, it's not even acknowledged from a census standpoint. So the French government and French society has been very reticent to have any official, or really any official data on the numbers of Muslims or the numbers of specific ethnic groups. So what this means is that the French state, as we know it today, is anti-pluralist. And I'm not using that as a pejorative term, simply as a descriptive term, that this is not how the French conceive of their state. Difference is to be avoided to some degree or to a large degree. Now, I'm also personally a small d Democrat, which means that I respect that the majority of French citizens wish it to be so. The majority of French citizens support laïcité, the aggressive form of secularism that France has. So I would never argue that laïcité is illegitimate. It's legitimate because the French people are sovereign, and this is what they want their elected representatives to reflect in official policy. So it's legitimate, but the question is it good? And that's what I want to get to right now. And I suppose the other broader question is, in increasingly diverse societies in the West, certainly, in the US where I am right now, but also more broadly throughout Western Europe, these are less homogenous societies, and they're increasingly diverse, largely because of the influx of Muslims over the past half century. In these increasingly diverse societies, should we learn to live with deep difference, or should we instead impose an artificial consensus and try to insist on uniformity and a kind of unity, that if anyone diverges from the consensus, that's bad, and we want to bring them into the consensus, and even in some ways coerce them into accepting the consensus? So that I think is a running question that we should keep in mind here. Now, to get to specifically to the French debate, defenders of French government policy often say that their issue is not with Islam, it's with Islamism. But I'll just be blunt. That's simply not true, and we should not take those claims at face value, and I'll tell you why right now. First of all, if we look at French legislation, in public schools, women are not allowed to wear the headscarf. In civil service, so if you work as a public servant in the French state, you're also not allowed to wear what's called conspicuous religious symbols, and that includes, of course, the headscarf. Now, you might say, well, that's just in civil service. So what? Not a lot of people are going to be in the civil service. But actually in France, at least 5.3 million people are in the civil service, which means that it will have a significant effect on any Muslim who wants to serve, any French Muslim who wants to serve his or her country. Also recently, the French Minister of Interior was railing against halal food aisles in supermarkets. And then we also have something that the French government has often complained about, and French commentators have complained about, which is that the fact that there are some French Muslims who don't want, especially French women, French girls who do not partake in mixed gender swimming pools, and they want to have female only swimming pools. The things that I just mentioned right now have nothing to do with Islamism. They all have to do with individual religious practice. And these are all examples of things that individual Muslims. We might disagree with that conservatism or that orthodoxy, but they are choosing to do so. And if a woman doesn't want to swim in a mixed gender swimming pool, that has no public implications, or it has no, that person is not trying to force any other woman to agree with her. So in that sense, again, it's an individual who's making a personal choice. Now, how is that really political Islam? Does that have political implications and public implications? Of course. But a lot of things in life have political and public implications. And I would also pose a broader question: why shouldn't religion have public implications? Throughout human history, that's just the way religion was. And it's only a relatively recent development where there has been this, somewhat innovative idea that religion should be in the home. It should be completely privatized. And anything that is out there in the public arena is somehow a political threat. So that kind of gets into this question of, is anyone really defining political Islam? So when Macron is railing against political Islam, when the Austrian leader, Sebastian Kurz, who Lorenzo mentioned, is railing against political Islam, a very big problem we hear is a lack of willingness, or perhaps a lack of ability, to define the terms that we're using. What is this political Islam? And I think once you actually dial down into a lot of these debates, the notion that this is just about a small minority of extremists should be rejected on its face, because if we look at the evidence, I just mentioned some of the examples, what French interlocutors and French officials are complaining about are not examples of Islamism. These are examples of, perhaps it's stuff that we would rather not be the case. Perhaps we wish that less Muslims were religiously conservative or personally practicing. But, in some religions, people decide to be conservative in their practice. And those are examples of people, just being conservative Muslims. Now, I think one implication, and I think when Macron talks about political Islam, I think we have to be frank here. He sometimes seems to be talking about conservative expressions of Islam. And that's where I think this gets very dangerous, and it becomes an issue of religious freedom. It's essentially the French state saying that it doesn't want French citizens who are Muslim to express their personal convictions and their own personal relationship with God in a conservative way. And I think from a moral standpoint, and as someone who believes that one of the most fundamental relationships in life is the relationship between an individual and his or her God, the French state is trying to intervene in that very personal relationship and to in effect change it. And we can ask about whether we're comfortable with that. So I think that the first step in getting more clarity on this debate is to be very clear about what our terms are, and then we can maybe have a more frank and open conversation. A couple points as I kind of round up here. It's also worth mentioning that the French state, and this also applies to other European countries to various degrees, are basically offering ultimatums where they're not asking Muslim organizations merely to reject political Islam, which I think is problematic because it's vague. They're going one step further, especially in France, and saying that they have to accept Republican values. And this is precisely the ultimatum that Macron has issued. And he's basically saying you have 2 weeks as French Muslim organizations to sign on and to accept this charter of Republican values. And if we actually look at the polling, and I'll just give you one example here, according to a 2019 IFOP survey, 40% of French Muslims say that they put their faith above Republican values. So basically what Macron is asking here is basically that 40% of his own French Muslim citizens accept his ultimatum. 40%. This is not a small minority. This is not a small minority of Islamic separatists or extremists. Now, one thing that the French officials often emphasize is that the law is neutral, that there is no explicit targeting of Muslims. But what we know historically is that discriminatory laws are often technically neutral. That's how they get around violating constitutions, which, in most countries guarantee some level of equality. And so, for example, and someone on Twitter brought this up as a kind of humorous analog. He said something like, if there was a law that forbids the rich and the poor alike from sleeping on the streets, that's technically neutral, but obviously it will only affect poor people who may not have access to shelter. Another example in the US case is gay marriage. When gay marriage was prohibited in the US a decade ago, people would sometimes argue that no one is allowed to marry someone of the same sex. So it applies to all citizens equally. But obviously, in practice, it's going to affect only those Americans who are gay. It's not going to obviously affect Americans who are straight. So this is just another example of how technical legal neutrality is a fiction. It's an illusion. And I think in many ways, it's a rhetorical sleight of hand that allows people to get around what the fundamental issue is, which is that laws that restrict in France and elsewhere conspicuous religious symbols will by definition disproportionately affect Muslims, because Muslims are disproportionately practicing and significantly more practicing than their non-Muslim counterparts in France. But this also applies in much of Western Europe, where the gaps are tremendous. We have polling that, on average, 50 to 60% of Muslims in various countries say that religion is very important in their daily life. The numbers in, say, France or Sweden or Germany are closer to around 10%. So we're talking about a 40% gap in religious observance. So the last thing I'll say, to just wrap it all up, is are Macron's policies, these are all kind of conceptual and theoretical objections. We have to also ask ourselves, are Macron's policies, putting morality aside or theory aside, are they actually effective? If the goal is to actually get more French Muslims to integrate, obviously there's a big chunk of French Muslims who are already quite secular and they accept laïcité. But for the 40%, and people can debate what the numbers are, but the 40 or 50% who aren't fully on board with this aggressive secularism, those are the people that you want to appeal to. Those are the people that you have to be worried about. So just doubling down on this aggressive secularist approach, is that likely to get those people on board, or is it likely to alienate them further and to make them feel that they are not accepted as fully French, that they don't actually belong? And in effect, what is being asked of these French Muslims who prioritize their religion over Republican values, essentially Macron is asking them to choose between their two identities, to choose between their Muslim identity and to choose between their Muslim identity and their French identity. And I think that puts citizens in a very untenable situation. It's a very difficult thing to ask of someone, to choose between two identities that are dear to them. And that puts them in some sense in this impossible position. And it's hard for me to imagine how that approach is going to be effective. It hasn't been effective up until now, because it's not as if Macron is introducing something new. Laïcité is part of French culture. It's been part of French government policy, and it's intensified, I would say, since the 2004 law on conspicuous religious symbols. So it hasn't been particularly effective up until this point. And we know that because we're having this panel. We wouldn't have had this panel if France didn't have a problem. So I think we all agree that there is a problem. And it's clear that an aggressive approach to laïcité has not actually produced the results that Macron and others say it should. And now they're saying, let's double down. But when has it ever been a good idea to double down on a failed policy?
Well, thank you. That was excellent. We're so glad that we have Lorenzo back, because this panel would not be, in any way as beneficial without him. Because what we need to do is we need to get some conversation going to understand where the truth lies between these two positions. And we'd like to hear from you, Lorenzo. First of all, just to quickly recap what Shadi was saying. I mean, he was essentially saying that an important takeaway from what he was saying was France's position, the position of individual citizens in France, or individuals in France, is that they are not recognized as part of a group or as Muslims, but they're recognized only when their relationship between the state and the individual. And so it seems to somewhat eliminate the part of their identity that that is religious. And so I highly recommend any viewers watching this to watch our first webinar that we did in this series with Leah Greenfeld, because what she had to say in that it provides a lot of background to this contemporary ideology of the nation state, as opposed to a more imperial or feudalistic arrangement, in which the relationship between the rulers and the governed was more of one between rulers and groups. And of course, what we have France seems to France and Germany and others seem to represent the more extreme, or I don't mean extreme in a pejorative sense, but the far end of the spectrum when it comes to atomization of individuals. So Lorenzo, perhaps you could give us your presentation, and then we'll have a discussion.
Yeah, just apologize again for the technical issues. Can I just know exactly when? Did you hear anything of what I said earlier, or
yes,
when did I cut off?
We did hear you. We heard you as you the last thing you were saying, which actually dovetails very much with what Shadi was saying, was that in reality, the policies of France and Austria and so on are not really about terrorism per se. They're more about Islamism, separatism, and so on. So.
Okay, so the very beginning. Okay,
yeah,
I cut off at the very beginning. I apologize for that. Yeah, what I was saying is, first of all, as you said, but it's not really about terrorism. And the second thing that I think it's very, very noteworthy is that we are talking about a fairly mainstream debate that really transcends some of the traditional left and right divides that we've seen. Macron is a centrist guy per definition, was sort of a darling of US progressives until a couple of months ago. Kurz is a center-right guy, but in a coalition with the Green Party. If we see who leads the debate on Islamism, again, mostly focused on social issues in Germany, it's a Green Party and most individuals with a Turkish secular background. I think that's interesting to look at the debate from both lenses. What I was trying to say also is that there's two ways of looking at it. I would say the strategic and the tactical. The strategic being, are these governments correct in being concerned about Islamism? And the tactical is, are the measures being adopted fair, effective, reasonable, and so on and so forth? So from the first point of view, I think there's two reasons to look at it. And since we're getting into a debate, my position is yes, those states, and France in particular, have a right to intervene when it comes to Islamism. And I think it's from 2 points of view. One is, as much as I said that it's not a matter of terrorism and radicalization, there is a solid concern in France and in other countries that the non-violent Islamist groups do create what in French parlance has become known as the Islamist ecosystem, that creates a fertile environment for jihadist groups. If you look at the studies that are shaping the debate in France, those by Jules Capel, by Hugo Micheron, by Bernard Rouget, they clearly show a direct connection between the work of groups like the Brotherhood, by Salafist milieus, and the radicalization level of certain areas. They explain why a city like Marseille, with a very large Muslim population, has seen virtually no cases of violent radicalization, but a city like Toulouse, with a smaller Muslim population, has seen a very high number of individuals who have engaged in terrorist activities. And the big difference between the two is the presence of non-violent Islamist groups in Toulouse and their absence in Marseille. So that part is very much there. But the second part is the social concerns that exist in France. And for example, the education system is a big part of that. The fact that one of the books that has been quoted by all French politicians is the book written by Jean-Pierre Robin, who was the Inspector General of the French education system, who for years documented how in French schools it was very difficult for teachers, at certain French schools, it was very difficult for teachers to teach Voltaire, to teach the Holocaust, to show movies without getting very strong, if not violent, reaction from students. From a French secular Republican point of view, that is unacceptable. The two things come together in the Paty assassination. The school teacher was beheaded. What really struck the French was, yes, of course, the beheading, but was the fact that the killer got a lot of support before and after the assassination, was the fact that people were egging him on online, that students pointed out the teacher when he went in front of the school, and that after there were 800 recorded incidents in the French school system of students that disrupted the memorial for the teacher. These are really the things that are driving the debate, the idea that there are certain common Republican values that are not accepted by a large part of the population. Now we get to Shadi's point as to whether the measures taken are the right ones or are they a boomerang. And that's, of course, a very complicated issue. And I think that's very difficult to judge, first of all, what Macron is doing, because he hasn't done anything yet. The law that was called initially the Separatism law, and now it's called the Law for the Reinforcement of Republican Values, in a very French way, was introduced yesterday. So I quickly read it, that it's a long law. There's not a lot of it that strikes me. We can go article by article, happy to do that, but there's not a lot of it that initially strikes me as very, very strong. It does reinforce the principle of laïcité, and Shadi is completely right in saying that laïcité is not neutral. I would disagree on the fact that there's a pretense of neutrality in the efforts to reinforce laïcité by the French. If you read the law, there's no pretense whatsoever. They clearly say the problem is Islamism, not Islam, but Islamism, and it is Islamist groups, Islamist actors that are creating tension with the Republican principle of laïcité. So there's no pretense of applying it to all groups there. I do also say I do slightly disagree with the other point of interpreting what Macron has been talking about. And again, we're still in the realm of mostly political statements and not practical measures when it comes to completely denying the religious attitudes of French Muslims. You know, the big partner in everything that Macron has been doing is the CFSCM, the translated in English, the French Council of Mosques. What's in something that would be impossible in a US setting, French laïcité doesn't prevent the French government with siding with a religious institution and saying this is the moderate partner that we choose, where we choose to support in different ways, including financially, as our partners against what they call separatism, Islamism, and so on and so forth. Has it worked in the past? Arguably no. I am, though, a believer in the fact that Islamism works in European countries and beyond, but let's just stick with Europe, irrespective of the system we have in place. We're all old enough on the panel to remember when when shortly after 9/11, the European conversations about radicalism were about the UK, The UK seemed to be the hub of jihadism, and everybody blamed multiculturalism. Was the fact that the Brits were too tolerant, they allowed religious groups to do whatever they wanted, and to some degree, I remember conversations with not just French people, but the French said, well, this problem, assimilationist approach by the French has not caused much radicalization. Well, clearly that's now we're reversing to some degree the approach, and I'm hard-pressed to find any European country, no matter where they fall on the spectrum between assimilationist French approach and hyper multiculturalist approach, like the Swedish approach or the British approach, and everything in between, that doesn't face the same kind of problems to some degree, that is not confronted with Islamist groups that espouse a certain divisive narrative, and a cross-section, I would say still a minority cross-section of the Muslim community that to some degree follows them. So I'm a bit in disagreement of the idea of Islamism and sympathies for Islamism being simply a reaction to policies by government. There's no question that certain policies can help Islamists in their efforts, but to see it as purely reactionary, I think it's a bit incorrect. Let me close it. I'm sorry, I'm kind of mixing my response to Shadi, which I've heard only partially, and my initial remarks. So I apologize if it's a bit all over the place. I think it's a bit early to judge the measures that we have seen in France. As I said, the only law that we've seen for 3 weeks is the law that was presented, the so-called General Security Law, which was introduced 3 weeks ago by the government, which mostly deals with matters that are only tangentially related to Islamism. And the new law was presented, as I said, 24 hours ago. There's more to discuss about the Austrian laws, because some of them date back to 2015. There's two different laws that were introduced last year, and there's a new bill that was introduced 2 weeks ago by the Austrian government. So there's more meat there. I'm a bit taken aback, and I'm not saying this is what Shadi did at all. But of some of the commentary that I've seen from other people in the States, where the criticism of the French was based on very much on misinformation. The story going around about the French government assigning a number to Muslim children as if this was the 1930s. That rumor went around in fairly mainstream circles, including some fairly mainstream journalists in the States.
BBC actually.
Washington Post. But we're not. And of course, that created a very big backlash in right-wing and left-wing circles. I mean, listen, the biggest critic of Macron right now in France is Marine Le Pen. I think that tells you a lot. But I think there's been a bit of a overreaction in, again, not putting Shadi in that category, but a bit of an overreaction in some quarters of the US media and punditry on what the French are up to, because, as I said, of course, there's been some rhetoric that is tough, but when it comes to practical actions, what we've seen the shutting down of two entities. Both of them have been affirmed by the Conseil d'État, the top administrative body in France. And there's been, of course, investigations, and of course, there's been proposals of laws, which will go through their parliamentary itinerary, and there's a system, of course, in place. So I'm not here, obviously, to say that everything that Macron, Kurz, and other European governments have said and will say and have done and will do is correct. I'm sure a lot of them are not, or at least I don't agree with them. But I think we have to be specific about what exactly are the measures we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And well, that sets out a lot of really interesting parameters for the conversation. Shadi, something you pointed to was the need to define terms, and you kind of went through some of these examples of ways in which what's been put forward seems to be not going after political Islam, but after Islam itself, or at least particular expressions of religious practice or belief. And so one of that question is, how is political Islam or Islamism, how would it be defined? Are the are there things that legitimately might be constrained? And if so, what would that look like? And even on the legal side, and Lorenzo, this may be somewhere you come in, maybe with the Austrian example or others. Legal in law, how is Islamism or political Islam being defined? So maybe first to you, Shadi, what might that look like if it weren't going after Islam itself, but after some form of political Islam? Could that happen? And if so, what would it look like?
Shadi, you're muted.
Oh, yeah. Luckily, Macron has told us some of what he thinks on these matters rather explicitly. I mean, there was his famous statement that Islam is in crisis all across the world. He didn't say Islamism. He didn't say some aspects of it, Islam. Which is, first of all, I think a ludicrous statement for a French leader to make about the entire world. I mean, is Islam in crisis in Senegal or Burkina Faso? I mean, I'm not sure, probably not. But putting that aside, I mean, Macron and also Sebastian Kurz, as I alluded to earlier, are not willing or perhaps not able to define what they mean by Islamism or political Islam. And those of us who have done a lot of work in the Middle East, we try to be precise with what we mean by Islamist groups or Islamist parties. I don't really see that precision here, in part because I suspect if we did see more precision, we would find out they're not just talking about Islamism. And I think that, I don't know if Lorenzo might have missed this specific example that I raised earlier, but according to an Institut Montaigne poll from a couple of years ago, 56% of French Muslim women are comfortable in mixed gender swimming pools. That's good, slight majority, but that suggests that there's more than 40% of French Muslim women who are not comfortable with that and would prefer to have female-only spaces in the local swimming pool. That's been a very big issue in France, and it's discussed a lot in the same breath as the Islamism conversation. And I think it's extremely problematic and just like empirically incorrect to say that someone who doesn't want to be in a mixed gender swimming pool is an Islamist. If that's really what we're talking about here, we have a very serious problem, because the target is conservative Islam. The target is Muslims who are on the more religiously observant side. And maybe it's better if we all come out and speak frankly about this. The problem that a lot of European officials and European commentators have is with Muslims who are religiously conservative. I would appreciate that. And that's actually, as someone who has done interview work with right-wing populists, I spent quite a bit of time with the AFD last year interviewing some of their leaders on this. And I actually appreciated that, hey, they're kind of Islamophobic. They are. But at least they're explicit about what they have an issue with, which is Muslims being religious. So I think that's part of the lack of clarity here. And also, I'll just one last thing I'll say on this is, why? So Macron is a centrist, I guess, as Lorenzo said, but that's actually not very encouraging to me, because the whole mainstream of debate in France, also in other countries like Austria and even Germany to some extent, has actually shifted rightward, where you don't actually have to be a right-wing populist to engage in some of what I would consider to be this problematic rhetoric. And I would say also that in France, it's the entirety of the political spectrum which basically sees the presence of Muslims as a problem to be solved. That there's a lot of Muslims, the percentage of Muslims will increase significantly from now until 2050. And according to the Pew projections on this, France might have as many as 15% of its population being Muslim in 2050. So there is a kind of urgency in trying to address this. And I am an American, so I have a bias. And I think I should have probably mentioned that earlier, although I assume our listeners can tell that I'm American. But we have I think Americans generally, we have a particular conception of pluralism, which is profoundly different than the European one. And I'm not talking about multiculturalism. I'm actually not a big fan of multiculturalism as it's often discussed. What I am a fan of is that difference is not a threat to democracy, that in diverse societies, difference is inevitable. Diversity of ideological and political approaches is inevitable. And in Rawlsian terms, I think there's something quite, I think, rich about a society that has citizens who subscribe to different comprehensive doctrines. We, as citizens, have different conceptions of the good life. And for the state to tell me that my conception of the good life, which is a very personal thing, is anathema to the state, is scary to me. And I would be probably considered an Islamist in the French context because I disagree with laïcité. I'm not obviously a supporter of laïcité. I have my criticisms of it. I don't support French Republican values. So if you took me, Shadi, and put me into France because I don't subscribe to French Republican values, I would likely be considered an Islamist. And, you know, that's sort of where we're at right now.
Lorenzo?
Yeah. A few things. Well, no, actually, let me ask directly a question to Shadi. What is it, for example, of French Republican values you wouldn't adhere to?
I mean, laïcité, we can talk about like what aspects of it, but I think that the fact that any kind of public manifestation of religion is seen as a threat to the state and a threat to social cohesion, even though it's a reflection of individual religious practice. So the headscarf being the most sort of obvious, but also somewhat tiresome example, that, you know, if I'm a French Muslim and I want to get a job in the civil service, and if I was a woman, I would have to take off my headscarf. I mean, that to me is like, and a lot of Americans, I think, struggle with that. And that's just one example. But how, and also if I insisted on workplace prayer exemptions in my place of work, maybe a private company would allow me to do so, but it would generally be seen as a not very French thing to do. And my coworkers might talk to themselves and be like, this is a little bit problematic because that's not really what Republican values are. You keep that in your home. You can pray in your home, pray in private, but you don't ask people in a co-working situation or in a public situation to get out of your work or to get out of your school, and especially if you're in a public school, those kinds of things.
All right, I understand. No, and listen, the law was created in 1905. Obviously, the time where Islam was not on the radar of anybody who crafted the law, and it was unquestionably militantly anti-religion. If you put it in a French perspective, was done at a time where the French Republic needed to assert itself over the Catholic Church. Had nothing to do with Islam. Now, fast forward to today, there's no question, and you're completely right, that it is applied disproportionately to Muslims because Muslims, as you said, are more outward religious and so on and so forth. Even though 4 years ago, the big controversy was about the creche and the inability to put, public, the sort of Christmas time decorations and all that kind of stuff in public places in France, even in directly public or publicly subsidized places in France. So it is applied in a very strong, very aggressive, very militant way. I do understand the discomfort that it causes to some French Muslims. I would say that anybody who knows French society a bit knows that there's a vast majority of French people who have no problem in juggling their two identities and understanding what the limitations are.
Lorenzo, on that, could I just ask you so I don't know if you caught, I mentioned a couple polls, but one of them is the IFOP poll from 2019 that 40% of French Muslims say they privilege their Muslim identity over Republican values. I mean, we can disagree on the numbers, but let's say 40% of French Muslims aren't totally on board. That's not a small minority, right?
There's a 55% of French Muslims who said that Sharia should prevail on French Republican law. So that even reinforces your point even more. That is not to say that all French Muslims think like that. But these are actually what concern the French. The argument you make about accepting that degree of diversity is very American, and I understand it works in the United States. It's not the way the French state has been organized from day one. And I do understand, and I think we can all appreciate there's different cultures, different constitutional frameworks, and they apply in different ways. Now, the question is, how much should the French state push, and what is the backlash? Should it accommodate certain things or not? Now, what the French do see is that a lot of these battles that exist on the hijab, on the swimming pools that you mentioned, are really battles that are pushed by a small network of Islamist activists. If you see who some of the girls who went to school with the hijab and then kicked out and sued the school, they all come from a very, very tiny milieu of mostly Brotherhood-leaning and Salafi-leaning activists who get, for political purposes, in a direct confrontation with the French state. Because, of course, they want to play the victim card and play identity politics in a way that helps them in what they're trying to do. That is not to say that a substantial amount of French Muslims are not uncomfortable with some of them, but I think it has to be clear that the direct confrontation comes at the incitement, if not direct planning, of some very minoritarian Islamist groups. Let me go to another point that you mentioned earlier, is the vagueness of the definition of what political Islam is. I can't speak for France. I hope, I do want to hope that the Macron government has a solid definition of that. When it comes to Austria, there is a definition of that. It has been made public. There's a body that was created last summer, which full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board, which is a documentation center for political Islam that has a working definition of political Islam that is being adopted by the Austrian government in its law against political Islam. We can discuss that definition. It could be acceptable, not acceptable. We can agree, we can disagree with it. But there's, of course, once you create a law, there's an attempt to give it some precision.
Dr. Lorenzo, can I just jump in with a question? You mentioned that you advise Austrian government on issues on Islam or Islamism in particular. Austria as a republic, but which was part of the empire in the past, ruled some part of the Muslim world, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I am based at the moment. And surely they would have tremendous experience with Muslim population. After the Ottoman Empire withdrew, the Austrians took over Bosnia and then annexed it. So we lived under Austrians for 40 years or something. And also currently the Austrian Minister of Justice, Alma Zadic, she's actually a Bosnian migrant in Austria. Do you think, maybe you had those discussions given her portfolio, but do you think the Bosnian experience of traditional Islam in Bosnia and the way it's separated from the state would be a good platform for discussions when it comes to discussing issues of Islam or Islamism in Austria?
And just to add to that really quickly, I mean, and I'll share the screen in a little bit, but when Bosnia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as Osman alludes to, they were quite comfortable with very conservative Muslims and didn't seem to have any problem at all in or perceive a threat at all to the state or to the rulers. Go ahead.
Osman, it's a very good question, because indeed, even still now, the law that regulates Islam in Austria is a law from 1912, is the Islam Gazettes, which was passed in the time of the Augsburg, the dying days of the Augsburg Empire. And it is a law that is excellent in a sense that it puts, unlike the legislation of some other European countries, it puts Islam on the same footing as all other religions, as a religion that is recognized by the state, that receives funding from the state, that has a right to teach, to appoint its teachers in public schools, and so on and so forth. And of course, that historical experience is definitely still there in Austria. What has happened in Austria over the last few years is that, again, we go back to my previous point, they understood that a very small but highly organized network of mostly Brotherhood-affiliated activists with some connections to the AKP recently have, to some degree, managed to monopolize that sort of administration. The big reform that was passed in 2015, not by Kurz, but by the socialist-run government, was to stop, among the different things that it was done, was to stop foreign funding of Austrian Muslim organizations, because they understood that there are foreign influences which were benefiting mostly Islamist actors, and to take away basically the contract that a couple of organizations had to train imams, because they were teaching things that are not acceptable. When you use Karadaui's book that teach certain things that are not acceptable by Austrian constitution, paid, subsidized by the Austrian government, then that's where you have a problem. So the problem is not with, nobody has talked about reducing the status of Islam in the Austrian constitution, or that's not what the Islam Gazettes was about refining certain aspects and certain deviations of a law that puts Islam on the same footing as other religions, because of course certain dynamics have intervened over time.
But why is it that the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not perceive a threat from conservative Muslims and the current one does? Is it only because of terrorism, or is it something related to the modern nation states' need to have a monopoly or a hegemony over over sovereignty, essentially?
Well, I think we didn't have Islamism under the Habsburg Empire. We had conservative Muslims. We didn't have Islamism. Islamism comes. Well, it starts at least a decade after the fall of the Habsburg Empire. So you could have had very conservative Muslims in parts of the Habsburg Empire, but there wasn't a political project that came with that, which we now see with groups influenced by the Brotherhood and other entities. Second, there was, of course, an approach that virtually all empires have. One thing is tolerating certain things in, let's call it the periphery, no offense, Osman, but the periphery of the empire, so in Bosnia and in Kosovo, but from a Viennese perspective, even Salzburg is the periphery of the empire. A different thing is when that Islamist component is in Vienna, in Salzburg, in Innsbruck, in Graz, and so on and so forth. That's a different thing. But the Islam of the 19th century is not the Islamism of 2020. We're talking about two completely different things.
I don't mean to jump on anyone's toes here, because I know that Jeremy had a question, but I did want to make a point here or ask a question that if we, let's say that we recognize for the sake of argument that a great deal of what is seen as a threat in Europe and is seen as Islamism is in fact not Islamism, but is just conservative Islam, as we mentioned, that existed in Bosnia during the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think we would hopefully recognize that likewise in Europe today there are just people who are conservative Muslims and they're not Islamists. But as you point out, Lorenzo, that often Islamist groups will represent or let's say like seize upon the concerns of conservative Muslims in order to sort of take the mantle of being champions of conservative Muslims, and then perhaps there's some even blurring or confusion between what is Islamism and what is conservative Islam. But my question is it worth And without even getting into the question, first of all, of so what? I mean, in other words, like, so you have Islamists that are doing that. I mean, what I'm not sure what is even that a threat to the state? And then second of all, even if it is a threat to the state in somehow or another, how do you go about dealing with that without stepping on the rights of conservative Muslims who just want to be able to practice their religion?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Shadi.
Lorenzo, if you want to start.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'll be very, very brief. Sorry, I think I'm monopolizing a bit. Listen, I think there's a general point. There's no denying that Europe could do better in being more tolerant of conservative Muslims. America does it so much better. There's no denying that Europeans are, let me use the non-academic word, freaked out by a niqab, by somebody who doesn't want to swim, men and women together, and things like that. And I do agree that that per se is not necessarily a threat to the state, and I think there's an oversensitivity in Europe. You can argue that it comes from having been extremely homogeneous societies throughout, and it's a totally different history from America. But at this point, we've been diverse society for 40, 50, 60 years. We should do a better job as Europeans. Having said that, the problem is, and not everybody does it well, but the problem is with Islamist groups who, as you very correctly analyzed, utilize those cleavages, those tensions to pursue a certain agenda that is highly problematic. That is really the big problem. It is, to some degree, my understanding, but definitely my hope, is that the European governments are capable of zeroing in on the Islamists within the law, within what is the constitutionally protected rights, without exaggerations, but zeroing in on those groups without targeting conservative Muslims who want to practice their religion in a way that is a bit foreign to the way most Europeans practice their religion these days, but are not a threat to anything.
So if I can just jump in here on this point, I mean, one thing I would pose to Lorenzo and to anyone else who's working on these issues in Europe is, why not have a concerted effort to clearly delineate between Islamism, i.e. Muslim Brotherhood influence type activity, and conservative Islamic approaches? So I can imagine, let's say, this would be really, I think, nice to see. I know it'll never happen, but if Macron with his advisors came out and said, hey, we want to be clear, we know some people are worried about this approach, we will be explicit. If you are an individual who's practicing your religion and you're conservative, it may not be exactly what France is used to, but that's one thing. What we are talking about here is a very narrow, specific definition of political Islam. That would be, I think, a helpful thing. But another point which occurred to me when I was hearing Lorenzo is this language of a threat to the state is fascinating to me. And again, it shows a cultural gap between our perhaps respective countries and continents. We don't really talk in the US, as many American viewers will know, about the state in the same way. And I have to say that as I've spent more time with my French friends, and we have very vigorous debates about this, especially lately, I mean, I grew up in a situation where the state didn't really exist. I mean, in the sense that we knew there was a federal government, but my parents, who were immigrants from Egypt and Muslim, they would never talk to me about the state being important in our lives. And this is, I think, a very, an important difference that's worth remembering. But I think that, there is also this issue that we're sort of skirting around, and I might as well just state it more explicitly. And I wrote a book. I wrote a book about this, so I'm not exactly bashful in talking about it. But I wrote a book about Islamic exceptionalism. That was the title, and it's very clear what I'm suggesting there. I'm not one of these people who wants to pretend that we're all basically the same, and Islam is, not too different from other religions. I think we should speak frankly about the distinctiveness of Islam insofar as that what would otherwise be considered private practice, as I sort of alluded to earlier, has public implications. That's what I think makes it challenging in the context of a Europe which has this very post-Enlightenment, and also, to be fair, somewhat Protestant-influenced idea of religion being a private matter, and it's more about your personal relationship with God, and the legal aspects aren't particularly relevant because, well, there is no really developed account of public law in either Catholicism or Protestantism, so on and so forth. Not to get too much into that, but I think that Islam does present a challenge that other religions are unlikely to present. And so I think that I want to acknowledge that it's not helpful to kind of paper over this. And I think that because Islam is different, it presents a different set of challenges. And I think a lot of, especially in Western Europe, less so in Eastern Europe, there was a sense that a consensus was reached about the role of religion in public life as of a few decades ago. It was that it's going to be mostly private. It's not going to be in the public sphere all that much. Christians experience rapidly decreasing levels of religious practice and identification. And it is a real shock to the system when, in a country that is ostensibly 90% of Christian background, like France, I've seen some estimates that there are more observant Muslims in France than there are observant Christians. And considering that Muslims in France are only about 7% of the population, that is absolutely remarkable. In a country where 90% of people used to be, or even more really, used to kind of be Christian, and now you just don't see many Christians who are practicing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Shadi, and this question of Islamic exceptionalism and the public dimension of religion, and we've been, even within the Religious Freedom Institute, have been having discussions around the idea of free exercise equality. That religion, it certainly has a private dimension, but it does have this public dimension as well. And certainly Islam has certain aspects of that, but I would say even conservative Christians, Catholics, and others have these public expressions, and that's where most of the challenges come. One, as we kind of come to a close, one point that I wanted to raise is it comes out even in the title of the draft law that was put forward that seemed to back away from this idea of separatism and talking about Republican values. And perhaps almost more concerning is this question of if Republican values as understood, if there's not a space for religious expression or certain types of religious expression are viewed as threats, Shadi, that you were saying, this kind of threat to the state, even more so a threat to the values of the state. And so because of that, we are going to press into the rights of parents to homeschool their children, because we're concerned that parents may teach their children things that are against the values of the state, whether that's Muslim parents or Christian or Jehovah's Witnesses or foreign influence. That if you receive funding from co-religionists outside the country, that's now something that's such a threat, not in a violent sense necessarily, but on a values threat. That's a threat to the values of our society. That raises really concerning questions of what are those values and what tools of the state are being used to enforce those values, and is that accommodating of a sufficient level of difference? Are those values able to accommodate that difference? And I think that's where so many of these debates come, and what we're kind of within this project trying to elucidate some of those questions, but for our five more broadly of trying to put forward a principle that does accommodate for difference in a much more robust way, while also dealing with the security concerns or others that may be there.
But could I ask, I mean, Jeremy, I mean, at some level, European officials don't recognize your starting premise that difference is something that is supposed to be accommodated, or that it's good to allow people to live different sorts of lives on the things that they care about as individuals. And I know, I mean, this is hosted obviously by the Religious Freedom Institute. So, I mean, I guess there is obviously an interest in religious freedom that I share quite strongly, but if your starting premises are different on some of the most foundational questions about modernity and the role of religion, I mean, that's why I found that even with my closest French friends, we can agree sometimes on a lot of other things. We try to figure out the stuff on French secularism, and at some point we just have to say, listen, it's irreconcilable. It's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world, because what's more fundamental than the question of accommodating deep difference? If you don't think difference should be accommodated, then that's the end of the discussion in some ways. I'm just curious, like, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think so, but is that possible? Is pluralism of a given? And if so, we have to find a way to live with that. Otherwise, it's a fascism of a very, very real sense of previous eras, and to the kind of counter of this, that secularism has never killed anyone. It just empirically isn't true, and so it is this question of, if we're going to accommodate difference, or if difference exists, it has to be accommodated or eliminated. And so I would vote for accommodation of some sort.
Well, the other option is to suppress it. Yeah, I think you're right. That is the stark choice in front of us right now.
Dr. Shadi, can I jump in? Just I'd love to ask you a question. I think approximately 2 years ago, you published a very elaborate essay or report with Peter Mandeville on Islam and statecraft. And one of the points that you discuss is the state's management of moderate Islam. Do you think there is a correlation between some Muslim countries trying to promote moderate Islam, what they call moderate Islam, and some European countries that are also trying to manage how Islam will be perceived and administered in their own countries? Is there any correlation between the two? Would you be able to elaborate on that?
Yeah, yes, there is, and I think one argument. I think I said this on Twitter the other day. I mean, few things have been worse for Islam than the modern nation state. And here I'm not talking about France or Austria. I'm talking about Muslim majority countries that I think have distorted Islam for much of the last century through aggressive state regulation of religious knowledge and religious production. So that's another one of my biases that I should be straight up about. As someone who does do a lot of work on this in the Middle East, I've seen what happens when the state tries to interfere in the individual's relationship to God. And these aren't Islamist governments. These are largely secular governments. So this is not necessarily an Islamist secular thing in the Middle East. I would actually argue that secular authoritarian states have been the worst thing for the Middle East. And, you know, obviously in this respect, France is wonderful relative to Muslim majority countries. So I also want to be fair and say France is a democracy. It's a country that has rule of law. And so in some sense, I don't want to be too hard on France, but I don't think France should be compared to pretty lousy Muslim majority countries on these particular questions. But this does inform how I view, whenever I hear things about the state trying to create a distinctive Islam, this talk about the state working with the French Muslim Council to build a French Islam or to try to promote moderate Islam, I just instinctually get very nervous about any kind of project that tries to do that. First of all, the idea of moderate Islam, I think, is inherently problematic because it presumes that the default for Muslims is that they're not moderate and that we need the state to help them become moderate.
Thank you.
Lorenzo, I wanted to ask, so ISIS in their magazine Rumi, they one of the last issues that was published before they were destroyed, thank God, they had on the cover of their magazine a picture of a Moroccan Muslim in France carrying a sign or something like "Je suis Charlie" or whatever, and it said, and the caption was "Destroying the Gray Zone." So for them, they have this concept of destroying the gray zone, which is, in other words, that for them, the gray zone is that area where Muslims are living in Europe, or living among non-Muslims in a way that is peaceful, that is that is sort of in a pluralistic society. And for them, they see one of the major reasons or aims of their attacks, such as the horrific attacks of the beheadings of priests and so on that we've seen in France and in Europe recently. They see that one of their major aims is to put Muslims in a position where they either have to, according to them, apostate, that is, carry signs like "Je suis Charlie," which for them is apostasy, and but it frankly is putting Muslims in a very awkward position where, okay, now there's some pressure to carry a sign saying that you support a magazine, which to me is a repulsive, disgusting magazine, so why should I be put in a position where I have to carry a sign saying I support that? In order to signal that I am against these kind of terrorist attacks. So in other words, they want to put Muslims in a position where they either apostatize or become Christian, or for them, which amounts to the same thing, carrying signs that saying that they support Charlie Hebdo. Or on the other hand, that they join ISIS and they become what for ISIS are true Muslims. That is, people who are engaged in a war against the infidel. So destroying the gray zone means creating a situation where it is impossible for the conservative Muslims, the people who are neither violent Islamists on the one hand, or on the other hand, just completely signing off on things that they just totally disagree with. Isn't to some extent not only the actions, because as you mentioned, Macron hasn't done anything legally, but his statements and the statements of his government and the actions of the French government, aren't these actions, don't they bear some risk of helping ISIS in a way to destroy the gray zone, so-called gray zone?
Absolutely, that is the risk that they incur. I agree, for example, with what Shadi said, that the Islamism crisis statement by Macron was probably not his best moment. He could have, I would be upset with the speechwriter if I were Macron about that statement. There's no question, though, that, again, a lot of the things that are being said and done by Macron are very much manipulated and used by a variety of Islamist actors that go from ISIS all the way down to more mainstream ones to create exactly that polarization that is highly problematic. There's no denying that at times French authorities give good ammunition to these actors to play that role. There's no question about it. At the same time, listen, Ismail, I don't think that in France you necessarily have to be parading around with the Je suis Charlie placards. Tarek Obru, who's somewhat become the de facto imam of France to some degree, and he's somebody who comes from a brotherhood milieu, unquestionably, openly says so, has put in a fairly smart way, and in an interview with Le Monde shortly after the publication of the latest cartoons, just they offend me, I don't like them, it's their right to put them out, smart enough to ignore them. That's, I think, the reasonable approach that anybody should have. As we know, Charlie Hebdo is an equal opportunity offender. I mean, the stuff that it puts out against everybody. I mean, I'm Italian. The stuff that they put out against Italians, French-Italian rivalry is notorious. It's extremely offensive. That's the way it goes. There's no question that the debate needs a time to be framed better. As I said at the very beginning, I'm not here to defend everything that the French or anybody else in Europe for that matter does. There's a lot of things that can be improved in communication. There's no question that at times some politicians do want to strike certain chords, either A, because they lack a sophisticated language, or B, because they understand that they strike chords with a certain part of the electorate. There's no question about it. Things can be done better. But on the other side, there is this tiny minority which instrumentalizes in a very cynical way these tensions, these cleavages that do exist.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeremy? Well, you're on mute, Jeremy.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Thank you all. I think we'll end it there. There's certainly much more to pick up. And certainly, I think maybe we accomplished our goal, which was really to use current events as an excuse to get to a much bigger conversation on this question of difference and how we live with deep differences, and using Islam and the state really also is an excuse to get to that question. So Lorenzo, Shadi, thank you both for joining us in this conversation, and we look forward to resuming the conversation again before too long. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on, Osman.
Thank you.